presentation today is about two sisters, born to the Catholic monarchs Isabel and Ferdinand. Both will become queens in their own right, but both were deceived by the powerful men around them, and neither got to rule. Controversial questions still remain today over both Catherine and Juana, and we will attempt to answer those somewhat. In the last quarter of the 15th century, the Catholic monarchs, Isabel and Ferdinand, ruled over a union of Castile and Aragon that was arguably one of the most powerful political entities in Europe. Their marriage had united Castile and Aragon, protecting both from incursion by France, enabling them to lead a combined Christian force against the Moors, leading to the surrender of Granada in 1492. And their union formed the basis for the later formation of Spain as a country. Moreover, in 1492, Isabel and Ferdinand had financed Christopher Columbus' first expedition to the New World, thus cementing the future riches that would flow to Spain from there. If we look at the geopolitical situation in Europe in the 1500s, you can see that the Spanish monarchy controlled Naples and the trade routes to America. The Philippines would be conquered in 1565, and Flanders, already an ally through marriage with the Habsburgs, would join with Spain as one entity in 1556. The Habsburgs were always close allies of Spain. They controlled the Holy Roman Empire and had recently absorbed Hungary. England was still settling down after the end of the Wars of the Roses, and it only emerged as a significant player after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Despite having the largest standing army in Europe, France was torn between the monarchy's desire for centralisation and the nobles' wish to retain power. Portugal was isolated on the fringe of Europe and saw its opportunities more overseas in South America and West Africa. The union of Castile and Aragon, through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabel, forming the basis of the Spanish monarchy, had benefited enormously from the earth-shattering events of 1492. Firstly, the surrender of Granada and final defeat of the Moors in Spain. This gave them an enormous amount of leverage with the papacy and in turn with the other Christian states of Europe. Secondly, later that year, the discovery of the New World and consequent wealth that flowed into the royal coffers. Around this time, though officially still a union of Castile and Aragon through marriage, other European countries started to refer to the peninsula as Spain, an anglicised version of the Roman term Hispania. Ferdinand and Isabel aimed to cement their power through a complex web of alliances largely against France, and utilising their children by marrying them off to potential allies. Their eldest daughter Isabel was married to Prince Alfonso of Portugal in 1490 and was Queen of Portugal until Alfonso's death 1 year later, as well as being heir to Castile and Aragon after the death of her brother Juan. 6 years later, she was to marry Manuel I of Portugal. However, in 1498, she died after childbirth. The first son of Isabel and Ferdinand, Juan, was in April 1497 married to Margaret of Austria, daughter of Maximilian, the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor. Juan, however, died of fever in Salamanca in October 1497, and consequently, Juana, his younger sister, now became the heir and Princess of Asturias when her older sister Isabel died the following year. Maria, the younger sister of Juana, would in 1500 marry the widower of her sister Isabel and become the Queen of Portugal. They had 8 surviving children, one of whom became King of Portugal, and a daughter who was the Holy Roman Empress. Catalina, or Catherine as we know her better, was first married to Prince Arthur of England and then to his younger brother Henry after the death of her first husband. For Catherine and Juana, both marriages would end in tragedy, but in different ways, as they became victims of the aims of the powerful men around them. In Catherine's case, there was only one man largely to blame, her second husband, Henry VIII of England, although his father, Henry VII, had his moments too. Juana's case was a little more complicated, as being the heir to the crowns of Castile and Aragon made her a target for intrigue from her father, Ferdinand, and husband Philip. After their respective deaths, her son Charles, who inherited the Habsburg titles and became the Holy Roman Emperor, as well as the King of Castile and Aragon, continued to victimize her. But let's start the presentation with Juana, as she's not as well known to English speakers as her sister Catherine. On paper, Juana was the Queen of Castile from the death of her mother Isabel in 1504 to her own death in 1555. However, we will see later that she rarely got to rule. She was born in 1479 in Toledo, the third surviving child of the Catholic monarchs. Like all royal children, she was extremely well educated in arts, sciences, geography, history and philosophy, and could speak all the Iberian languages, including Catalan and Galician Portuguese, as well as French and Latin. In addition, she was quite an active and sporty girl, taking a keen interest in riding, hunting and hawking. She was also an accomplished clavichord player. Her mother, Isabel, was intensely religious, and in particular felt it her duty to God to remove the Moors from Spain. Under Isabel, the Spanish Inquisition started, and she later expelled the Jews, a harsh treatment to the former who had largely financed her wars and her expeditions to North America. The expeditions of Columbus, at least at first, she regarded as being missionary expeditions aimed at bringing the Christian faith to the native people. But Juana, however, never showed the same level of religious devotion, and according to some sources was brutally punished by her mother for her more moderate faith. This was later cited as evidence of Juana's insanity. According to the letters of the gentleman of Ferdinand's bedchamber, Juana was subjected to a torture method called la cuerda, which involved being hung by her hands. You can see that in the picture bottom left on the screen. In 1496, at the age of 16, Juana entered into a proxy marriage with Philip of Austria, who was based in Flanders, son of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. Shortly after Philip's birth, the King of France suggested a girl had been born, not a boy, and his step-grandmother, Margaret of York, held him aloft in public to clearly show he was a boy and put the record straight. Philip had acquired his nickname from the next King of France, Louis XII, who exclaimed on meeting him, "He is a handsome prince," giving rise to his famous nickname, Philip the Handsome. Perhaps this latest King of France wanted to correct the errors made by his predecessor. The political marriage between Philip and Juana came in the form of a two-part deal with Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, who agreed to marry his oldest son and heir Philip to Juana and his daughter Margaret to Juan, Juana's brother. And remember, at this stage it was Juan who was the heir to the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, not Juana. In August 1496, Isabel accompanied her daughter Juana to Laredo on the northern coast of Spain. Juana was only ever to see one of her siblings once again, by accident Catherine, in England in 1506. Isabel had wisely written to King Henry VII of England asking him to shelter her daughter if they had to seek refuge in England due to storms, and indeed they did, and for 3 days Juana's ship was moored at Portland, where she was entertained by local nobility in a manner befitting the daughter of the Catholic monarchs. If you go to Laredo today, you can see the house where Isabel and Juana stayed before the journey, with its plaque on the wall outside. The house must have been impressive in its time, as the plaque explains that in August 1496 Isabel and Juana stayed there 1 month, Catherine and Isabel in 1501 prior to her marriage trip to England, and even the son of Juana, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, stayed there in October 1556. Juana finally arrived in Flanders during September, but with no Philip to meet her, and the couple first met face to face on October the 19th, 1496. The wedding had actually been planned for the next day. However, it was lust at first sight for the couple, and Philip demanded that the priest bless them on the spot, and then the couple made their way to their private chambers, only to reappear the next day for the official ceremony. Whilst the marriage had got off to a great start, in contrast to what Catherine would experience, Juana's fatal attraction to Philip was in the long term to prove her downfall. Together the two would go on to have 6 children, including Charles V, who would become King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand, who succeeded his brother as Holy Roman Emperor, and 4 daughters, all of whom would go on to become queens in their own right. Eleanor, who was at various points Queen of Portugal and Queen of France, Elizabeth, the Queen of Denmark, Maria, the Queen of Hungary, and Catherine, who married the successor of her sister Eleanor's husband to become the Queen of Portugal. Philip was from a Habsburg and Burgundy background, where the man ruled the nest, unlike Juana's experience with her mother Isabel. And he soon started to control Juana. She could not turn a blind eye to his infidelity and other diversions, and often flew into rages. She would be banished to her rooms, and often went on hunger strikes. She attacked Philip's mistresses, and eventually Philip asked his treasurer to keep a diary of her actions, which he eventually used against her, showing it to her parents. One has to remember that Juana was brought up in the most conservative Catholic court in Europe. Her mother was more holy than the Pope. It was an enormous culture shock for her to be sent far away into what was a very liberal establishment to which she was just not accustomed. The story of Juana formed a small part of the Spanish national TV series Isabel, which was then followed by a mini-series telling the story of Juana and Philip in more detail, called La Corona Partida, the Divided Crown. You can actually find it on Spanish Netflix, but unfortunately with only Spanish subtitles. However, there is a YouTube channel called Isabel in English, and on that channel you can watch various clips from both series with English subtitles. If you are interested in this period of history, one easy way to sample it is through several TV series. Often they are not 100% historically accurate, but they do offer an entry point into then studying the period further. Isabel, the Spanish TV production, I've already mentioned, but it's extremely difficult to find with English subtitles. The follow-up, going more into the detail of the lives of Philip and Juana, La Corona Partida, is on Spanish Netflix, but only with Spanish subtitles. 3 English versions are the White Queen series. Firstly, the White Queen, which covers the Wars of the Roses. Secondly, the White Princess, which covers the period of Henry VII and his wife Elizabeth of York. And finally, the Spanish Princess, which revolves around Catherine of Aragon and her marriage to Henry VIII. Juana was never groomed for statesmanship by her parents because she was third in line to the throne of Castile, behind her brother Juan and her elder sister Isabel, who both died. However, her brother Juan died in October 1497, some said of overindulgence in sex. He had married Margaret of Austria in January 1497 and died in October, so the heir to the throne became her elder sister Isabel, who had married King of Portugal Manuel. However, she died soon after childbirth, and now Juana was the sole heir. With this sudden rise in status, Juana became increasingly politically useful, and Philip began attempting to assert increasingly control over his independent-minded wife. In reality, she was the Princess of Asturias, i.e. the heir to the throne of Castile, but Philip started to call himself the Prince of Asturias, a title which he was not allowed to use. Going back to Juana's brother Juan, who died in 1497, it's interesting just to take a closer look at him. He was the first son of Isabel and Ferdinand, and heir to the thrones of the two kingdoms. It was arranged that he would marry the sister of Philip the Handsome, and the ships that took Juana to Flanders actually returned back to Spain, bringing Margaret to her wedding in Burgos in 1497. Juan was never a strong child, and it became clear to all in court that there was a very strong physical attraction between the two newlyweds, and the doctors advised Juan not to indulge so much. He died of tuberculosis in October 1497, thus making his sister Juana the heir to the two thrones. His wife Margaret actually stayed a while in Castile and taught French to Catherine of Aragon. After her return to Flanders, she ruled the Habsburg territories as regent for Charles, the son of Juana, until she died in 1530. As soon as she became heir, even before Isabel's death, Juana and Philip had to travel to Spain to be recognised as heirs to Castile formally. Normally that journey would have been made by sea, but Philip decided to go through France to visit his friend the King of France. This greatly concerned Isabel and Ferdinand, who demanded from the King of France that he make all necessary measures for Juana's safety, which to his credit he did. After the formal recognition by the Cortes, Isabel wanted Juana to stay in Castile to teach her how to be the queen, and to try to integrate Philip into Spanish customs and culture. Philip, however, left Juana in Castile. She was pregnant by this time with their fourth child, but eventually Juana decided to follow him back to Flanders. She found him there with another mistress, and after an enormous tantrum, Philip declared her insane. Isabel died on the 26th of November 1504. Castile and Aragon had always been united by the marriage of Isabel and Ferdinand, but neither of them had a legal claim over the other's territory. After Philip had made Isabel aware of what he called Juana's insanity, Isabel added a codicil to her will declaring that if Juana was absent, unwilling, or unable to rule, the regency would pass to Ferdinand until their grandson and Juana's son Charles became of age. Neither Isabel nor Ferdinand wanted Philip to become the regent, as they didn't trust him and believed he would represent the interests of Burgundy and possibly France in front of Castile. At the Council of Toro in 1505, Ferdinand proved to the Cortes that Juana was unfit to rule and that he should act as regent. However, he knew that his position with the Castilian nobility was not strong, so he did the unthinkable and he married the niece of the King of France to bolster his strength in Castile and against Philip. Finally, to avoid a possible war, it was agreed that Ferdinand and Philip would rule jointly in Juana's name. In January 1506, Juana and Philip sailed from Flanders to Spain to take up their rule in Castile. They ran into a terrible storm and their ship was forced to seek shelter at Falmouth. Word soon reached the English king, Henry VII, who invited just Philip to meet him. Philip duly proceeded to Windsor Castle, where he was met by Prince Henry, who was by this time contracted to marry Juana's sister Catherine. Juana followed later, and they were entertained by the English royal family for several days before continuing their journey to La Coruña in northern Spain. This proved to be the one and only time that Juana would meet any of her siblings after leaving Castile for her marriage in Flanders. The picture bottom left on the slide is of a fabric of pomegranates later sent by Juana and Philip to thank the people of Dorset for their hospitality during their forced landing. It still hangs today in the Church of St Mary's in Charminster in Dorset. After Juana was successful in being recognised as Queen of Castile by the Cortes, Philip and Ferdinand met in Villafafila in June 1506. The two men were determined that an unstable Juana would not rule. The negotiations could be considered a little one-sided, as Philip had an army present while Ferdinand a few courtiers, as is shown in the picture on the screen. It was agreed that Philip would become the sole regent of Castile and that Ferdinand would retreat to his homeland in Aragon, of which Juana was also the heir. On his return to Aragon, however, Ferdinand testified to a notary that he had been tricked into the agreement and he did not recognise its validity. In September 1506, Philip fell seriously ill in Burgos. A pregnant Juana hardly left her husband's side. Within 6 days, Philip the Handsome had died at the age of 28. Rumours spread quickly that Ferdinand had poisoned him, but Philip was always careful what he ate and drank, and even had official food testers. Despite the unkind treatment he gave Juana throughout their 10-year marriage, Juana refused to leave her husband's corpse for a disturbingly long time. It was his wish to be buried in Granada, and Juana decided to take his dead body from Burgos to Granada on foot. On the way to Granada, where Philip was to be buried, Juana was rumoured to have opened his coffin to kiss and embrace him. She insisted they travel at night so that women would not be tempted by him. During the day, she would rest in monasteries, deliberately avoiding nunneries. With Ferdinand away at war in Naples, Juana now had the chance and some support to seize power, but she did not act. Ferdinand, on his return from Naples, ordered that the procession stop at Tordesillas, close to Valladolid. Philip's body was interned there, and only moved to Granada when his son Charles ordered the building of the Capilla Real in 1521. Ferdinand took power from Juana in July 1507, dismissed his daughter's loyal supporters, and ordered Juana to be confined within the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, along with her youngest child Catherine. He visited her only twice before his death in 1516. She corresponded regularly with her sister Catherine in England. From reading Catherine's letters, it was obvious that Catherine did not regard Juana as insane, despite Ferdinand, in his letters to Catherine, continually asserting this. Shut in a house with 2 rooms. In the past, Juana had travelled throughout Spain with her parents, was present at the surrender of Granada in 1492, had lived in the Burgundy court, had visited the English and French royal families. Now she was a prisoner in 2 rooms. In January 1516, Ferdinand died of natural causes in Extremadura. Juana was only informed of this 4 years later, in 1520. Ferdinand's grandson and the son of Juana, Charles, became the King of Castile and later the Holy Roman Emperor after the death of Maximilian. The death of Maximilian took Charles increasingly away from Castile and Aragon, and this caused much resentment amongst the powerful nobility there. In 1520, unhappiness with Charles led to the revolt of the Comuneros, caused by suspicion of the Inquisition, the influence of Burgundy, high taxes, and unhappiness with Charles' foreign adventures. In Toledo, the rebels formed what they called a Holy Assembly, a Santa Comunidad or Santa Junta. They wanted Juana to be the figurehead for the revolt, and they attacked Tordesillas to free her. However, Juana would not betray her family and her son. She was sympathetic to the Comuneros, but did not sign any of their orders and waited for Charles' royal army to arrive and defeat them. The man in charge of Juana's imprisonment at Tordesillas was the Marquis of Denia. I thought it interesting to explore him in more detail, though in reality he had no connection with the town of Denia, he was just a title. He was very close to the royal families, having fought in Ferdinand's army, and indeed after the death of Ferdinand at Caceres in 1516, he accompanied the body to Granada for burial. Charles V appointed him to Tordesillas, and he governed it until his death in 1536. There he employed a very strict and cruel regime. Juana was often refused medical care and even had her personal possessions stolen. But did Denia, who obviously knew more than most about her, believe that she was insane? His correspondence to Charles V remains, and in that he rarely describes insanity, but often cautions Charles that Juana is a potentially dangerous rival. So he wrote, "We cannot allow her to talk to anyone because she can convince everyone." And further, "I have told the Queen her father is alive, because whenever anything is done to displease her, I say the King orders it and commands it." Denia isolated her by stopping her regular visits to a local convent and refusing nobles and other associates from visiting her. It was clear there was a conspiracy to keep her from public view. In 1525, Juana was dealt a serious blow when her 18-year-old daughter Catherine was taken away in the night to marry the King of Portugal. Juana sank into a deep depression and would spend the next 30 years until her death a virtual prisoner in a ruthless regime governed initially by the Marquis of Denia. She apparently became convinced that some of the nuns that took care of her wanted to kill her. Reportedly, it was difficult for her to eat, sleep, bathe, or change her clothes. She survived the death of her husband Philip by 49 years, but during this long imprisonment was rarely visited by her son Charles, but he did manage to include her image on coins of the realm. You can see the image on the coin on the left of Juana and her son Charles. Juana died of natural causes at the age of 76 on Good Friday 1555. Today she is reunited with her husband and parents in the Capilla Real in Granada. There also lay the remains of the son of her elder sister Isabel, Miguel, the Prince of Asturias. On paper, Juana was actually one of the longest serving Iberian monarchs, but seldom got to rule. However, her children were married into some of the most powerful families in Europe, and through her protection of her son Charles, she defended the Habsburg interest in Spain and Europe. Was she mad or just maltreated? We will return to that question after moving on to her younger sister, Catherine of Aragon. But before we do that, just a little on the Capilla Real in Granada. After the Catholic monarchs declared their wish to be buried in Granada, it was built between 1505 and 1517. It was originally part of the Cathedral of Granada, but now it is separate. Interred there are Isabel, Ferdinand, Juana, Philip the Handsome, and the grandson of Isabel, Miguel of Portugal, the son of her first daughter, Isabel. If you are ever in Granada, it's a must-see place, and it is right in the centre behind the cathedral and adjacent to the narrow streets of the Moorish Bazaar. Now on to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was born in Alcalá de Henares in 1485, the fifth and youngest child of Ferdinand and Isabel. Her statue today stands outside the Archiepiscopal Palace of Alcalá. Her great-grandmother was Catherine of Lancaster, who was the granddaughter of Edward III of England. Catherine actually had a stronger claim to the throne of England than the King Henry VII at the time. Like her mother, she was deeply religious and loyal to the Catholic faith, which is an important point when we consider that Henry VIII's main argument to null their marriage later. She was well educated, spoke numerous European languages. Her name, incidentally, comes from her father, who was the King of Aragon, even though she was born in Castile. Her elder sister Juana, who was born in Toledo, had taken the title Juana of Castile earlier. It is interesting to look in more detail at Catherine's descendancy from Edward III, who was King of England for 50 years, from 1327 to 1377. His son, John of Gaunt, had a daughter, Catherine of Lancaster, who in 1388 married Enrique III of Castile. Their son Juan was the father of Isabel la Catholica, the Queen of Castile, who married Ferdinand of Aragon, and their final child was Catherine. Henry VII, her father-in-law and father of the princes Arthur and Henry, was also descended from John of Gaunt, but not through a royal line, as he had to seize his crown in the Wars of the Roses. So Catherine had a claim to the throne of England by descent, whereas both her husband's rights had been acquired by war. From an early age, she was promised to Prince Henry, heir to the English throne, to cement a powerful alliance against France. Her father was keen to bring together an alliance of European countries against France, particularly to help his struggle for the Kingdom of Naples. For the Tudors, she was a very good match, as they were a new royal family, whereas the Trastámaras of Castile were one of the oldest and most powerful in Europe. The couple were married by proxy in May 1499, and in 1501 Catherine set sail from La Coruña to England, sheltering briefly in Laredo from storms on the northern coast of Spain. The young couple were married at a lavish ceremony at St Paul's Cathedral, November 1501. Arthur was Prince of Wales, so they left the capital more or less immediately for him to take up his official duties at Ludlow Castle, from where Wales was governed. Arthur was though taken ill and died in April 1502, aged only 15. It is thought he died from the sweating sickness, a flu-like illness thought to be spread by rats. Such a disease could kill anyone, rich, poor or royal. He was buried at Worcester Cathedral, and now Catherine was alone and a widow in a foreign country at the age of 16. There were various issues to deal with after such an unexpected death. Firstly, the dowry. Half had been paid up front by Ferdinand and Isabel to King Henry, but the second instalment was due in 6 months. The Catholic monarchs, optimistically, expected Henry to return the dowry and give Catherine a widow's pension. The Spanish ambassador at the time to England was a little more realistic, with his quote, "If gold enters Henry's strong boxes, it never comes out again." After the death of Henry's wife in February 1503, it was suggested in some circles, but never from the king himself, that he could marry Catherine. Isabel and Ferdinand were very quick to put a stop to this rumour. Later it was suggested that Henry could marry Juana after the death of Philip the Handsome. Ferdinand by this time was a widower, and he was not keen to have the King of England involved so deep with the Habsburg family connections. Catherine then settled down to live a very frugal life in London, often having to sell her jewellery to cover costs. She even served as the paid ambassador to England, Europe's first female ambassador. After the death of his wife, Elizabeth of York, when he was 46 years old, Henry VII began to search for a new wife. It was a European royal beauty contest from the finest families in Europe, and considered were Catherine herself, her elder sister Juana, Margaret of Austria, who you remember was the sister of Philip the Handsome and widow of Juan of Castile, and Juana of Naples. The lady in the picture is Juana of Naples. Henry actually asked to see her portrait, but then rejected her, a strange decision, and he never remarried and died 6 years later. Back to Catherine. Finally, it was agreed in June 1503 that Catherine would marry Arthur's brother, Prince Henry, Duke of York. But they would have to wait some time, as he was only 11 at the time. The other big stumbling block was that it was illegal to marry the widow of a dead brother. It was argued to the Pope that the marriage was void as it had never been consummated. We will return to that later. A draft agreement had been made for Henry and Catherine to marry as early as 1502, and it was signed in 1503 saying that the marriage could take place when Catherine's dowry was paid and when Henry achieved 15 years old. They were finally formally betrothed in June 1503. The death of Isabella in 1504 complicated things, as Henry VII allied with Philip the Handsome versus Ferdinand. By 1505 the dowry had still not been paid, and the king began to doubt that the marriage and the alliance would ever take place. Only in 1508 was it finally agreed, so this whole process took 5 years to come about. Henry VII died of tuberculosis at Richmond Palace 21st of April 1509, and he was buried in Westminster Abbey next to his wife Elizabeth of York. So on June the 11th that year, Catherine married the soon-to-become King of England, Henry VIII. She was 23, he was 17. 13 days later, the newly married couple were made King and Queen of England. These were happy days for Catherine, and she wrote as much to her father. Indeed, she was soon pregnant with what Henry hoped was a male heir. In June 1513, Henry appointed Catherine regent in England with the titles Governor of the Realm and Captain General, whilst he went to war against France. Taking advantage of this, the Scots decided to invade England, and in September 1513, Catherine ordered Thomas Lavelle to raise an army in the Midlands, march north and counter the Scots. In the TV series The Spanish Princess, Catherine is shown riding into battle against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. This is complete invention. In reality, she never went further north than Buckingham. However, at Buckingham she did address the reserve army, and through this speech she won over the hearts of the people as well as the support of the nobility of England. Despite the affection the people showed to Catherine, and despite the respect that she had won from the nobility during her times as regent, Henry regarded her main role in life as producing a male heir to succeed him. The tragedy of Catherine, particularly in comparison to her elder sister Juana, was her inability to produce a surviving male heir. She had many attempts, and indeed her son Henry was born on January the 1st, 1511, but he died several weeks later. Her only surviving child was Mary, born 1816, who against all the odds eventually became Queen of England and Queen of Spain from 1553 to 1558. By 1525, Henry had become infatuated with Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting for Catherine, and privately at least started to preach that God would punish a man who lays with his brother's widow. He suggested that Catherine retire to a nunnery. She refused. Henry then sent an envoy to the Pope to try to get the original marriage annulled on the basis that his father but obtained it by deception. Coming away empty-handed, Henry now ordered Cardinal Wolsey to set up a special court in England to judge Catherine on the matter. The Pope stood firm, possibly influenced by Catherine's nephew Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor and son of Juana, but Henry ignored them all and banished Catherine from court. This effectively ended papal supremacy over the Church in England. In March 1534, a new Act of Succession was passed in England, effectively placing Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry, as heir to the throne, and declaring Catherine's daughter, Mary, illegitimate. The Pope then excommunicated Henry. At the court hearing, Catherine had staged the scene for which she will be forever remembered. Refusing to recognise the validity of the court, she crossed from her seat, knelt before her husband, and proclaimed the validity of their marriage, her faithfulness as a wife, and the lack of blame that could be imputed to her for the loss of their children. Despite this dramatic plea, Henry did not relent. It was at Windsor Castle that she last saw him in the summer of 1531. The royal court was in residence when Henry rode out hunting one day, accompanied by Anne Boleyn. He gave orders that Catherine was to leave before he returned. Catherine was removed from court and stayed at Ampthill Castle for 3 years while the divorce was debated. It was here she found out the decision from the English court that the marriage had not been valid, and Henry married Anne Boleyn in January 1533. Later, Catherine was moved away from London to Buckden Castle in Cambridge. Catherine died on the 7th of January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle. On the day of her funeral, Anne Boleyn miscarried a male child, an interesting intervention of medieval karma. It was thought at the time that Catherine was poisoned as there was a black growth on her heart, but modern experts believe this was cancer, which was unknown at the time. She was buried at Peterborough Cathedral. Her tomb still reads today, Catherine, Queen of England. Today, every year, Peterborough Anglican Cathedral holds a Catholic Mass to commemorate her death, an event normally attended by the Spanish ambassador. There are big questions concerning each of the sisters. Firstly, Catherine. Was the marriage between Kathleen and Arthur ever consummated? Of course we can never know. On the one hand, she was deeply religious, so would she try to trick the Pope into annulling the marriage? Her father was keen to preserve the alliance through Prince Henry, but his wife Isabel was equally devout and unlikely to trick the Pope. On the other hand, Prince Arthur had boasted to his friends the morning after his wedding that he had spent the night in Spain. This evidence was later used by Henry in his special court, but what young man has not told lies about his prowess and his conquests? Was Juana really insane? Despite being lost at first sight, Philip and Juana had a very lively relationship and could be regarded as being the Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton of their era. The move to Flanders was difficult for Juana as she came from a conservative, ultra-traditional Catholic court ruled by her mother and moved into a country dominated by men and with a more liberal outlook. Even royal women were expected to ignore the infidelities of their men, and Juana was very jealous of Philip's various lovers. Throughout her adult life, she was manipulated in turn by her husband, her father, and her son, all of whom craved what she possessed, the crown of Castile. Of course, for those men, it was very convenient to have her cast as insane and unfit to rule. The title of today's presentation was The Tragedy of the Sister Queens. But what is more of a tragedy, being branded a lunatic, and even in Spain today being known as Juana la Loca, or being married to Henry VIII? The two sisters clearly suffered different types of tragedy. Catherine was a better survivor in a world dominated by men. She could compete with her father and her nephew Emperor Charles, but in her husband Henry she was fighting against a dictator in his own country. Both women were strong, passionate, determined, and defended their children. Catherine, however, was more politically astute than Juana, who was easily manipulated and abused by the powerful men around her. What Juana did excel at, though, was giving birth to a family that married into very powerful positions throughout Europe. Now in this tree you can see, with Juana and Catherine highlighted in the centre, it was ironic that two of their descendants, Philip of Spain, the grandson of Juana, and Mary, the daughter of Catherine, would marry each other and sit together, albeit briefly, on the thrones of England and Spain from 1554 until Mary's death in 1558. That ended in the breakdown of relations and the Spanish Armada, but that story is for another time.